Well, welcome everyone. Before we begin, I am excited to introduce Adam Stern, MBA Class of 1987, to provide background on the Conradin von Gugelberg Memorial event that we're all here for.
Thank you, Oliver, and thanks again to the volunteer students who have created such a wonderful conference today and in past years. The CVG Fund at the GSB is named after our MBA Class of 87 alum, Conradin von Gugelberg, who died in 1988. He was ahead of his time. We remember him most for his persistent concern for the planet. And in his memory, friends and family set up a fund to support environmental programs at the business school, including case studies, internships, and recycling initiatives. The CVG annual lecture has become a major gathering point for the business school and really for the entire Stanford community. Over the years, we've hosted a distinguished list of speakers, including Al Gore, 3 heads of the EPA, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and directors of leading environmental groups. More recently, the CVG Memorial event has been incorporated into the student-led Stanford GSB Climate Conference. It's nearly 40 years since this program first began, and I can tell you the people involved in its founding could not have envisioned how much this event has led to terrific dialogue and discussion. Climate change is only more urgent in that time, and we're just grateful that you're all here, and thank you to Oliver and his colleagues.
Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you to your classmates for your generosity in honoring Conradin and for making space for such an exceptional closing conversation. So with that, it is now my honor to introduce this year's CVG speaker, the 13th United States Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. Dr. Moniz served as secretary under President Obama from 2013 to 2017, where his accomplishments are lengthy, but among them, he strengthened the department's partnership with national laboratories, deepened collaboration with the DoD and the national security community, and advanced energy policy that earned bipartisan support. He also negotiated the Iran nuclear agreement and launched Mission Innovation, a global initiative that places science and technology at the center of government responses to climate change. Beyond his public service, Secretary Moniz spent 4 decades on the faculty at MIT, where he founded the MIT Energy Initiative and helped build one of the world's leading energy hubs for research and industry engagement. Today, he serves as the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems Emeritus at MIT, and is the founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation, as well as the co-chair and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. He does not sit still. He holds a bachelor's degree in physics from Boston College, and, more importantly, a PhD in theoretical physics from Stanford University, which makes it especially fitting to welcome him back to the farm today. Secretary Moniz will be in conversation with Jonathan Garfinkel, managing partner and co-head of private equity at TPG Rise, as well as a lecturer here at the GSB, where many of us have taken his classes and are inspired to work and dedicate our lives to climate because of his leadership and his example. And not to outdo Secretary Moniz, but Garf is a 3-time Stanford alum. So please join me in welcoming Secretary Moniz and Jonathan Garfinkel.
Thank you, Oliver. It is really, really delightful to be here, to see many, many familiar faces, and to have the absolute privilege to speak with Ernie in this setting. I think most importantly, our appreciation for Ernie being here has to incorporate the fact that he has been willing to incur a marital deficit because today is his wife's birthday. And so we have some side arrangements. We had a deal.
We had a deal.
We have a deal. non-disclosure agreement has been signed. But Ernie, as someone who's had the great privilege of working with you on everything from evaluating investment opportunities to together helping to educate congressional staffers on how their policy decisions influence the real world, it's a great honor, and thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure, but also let me jump in now and say that Garf has been one of the key lecturers to our congressional staff and is so enthusiastic, he's come back 2 more times to give the same lecture to a new group of congressional staff, which is great.
Unfortunately, the grand total outcome of that is where we are today.
I actually disagree with that. I'm sorry, we're starting right now.
We're starting, let the games begin.
And I'm going to say that I think the whole point of this set of interactions is that there are many communities within the climate space that really do not understand what each other do. And so what this is all about is bringing in professionals from different parts of the investment community, big banks, equity investors, others, and having them talk with the people who will be writing legislation and policy and getting them to understand what is it that gets someone to say yes to a clean energy investment.
Absolutely.
So Garf's been doing that now for all 3 of our pilot projects. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let's dive in, Ernie, and I think as everyone here knows, the theme of this conference has been every sector, every story, and I love that the group is using storytelling, which I think we would agree is incredibly important in our ecosystem. But for starters, maybe you can filter through and tell the group what for you is among the most impactful stories that resonates best as you are out telling them.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, I'll tell us a story. I mean, a history really of the trek towards realizing the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, and I think there are at least 2 very important lessons from that. So the story is that there's an analogy, always imperfect, to where we are in climate today, in the sense that throughout the 80s, there was a back and forth about the science, the non-science, ... with regard to acid rain. And of course, as time went on, the scientific balance tipped more and more towards, well, of course we understand the origin of acid rain, frankly coming from coal plants, largely in the Midwest, et cetera, sulfur emissions. And there was the first interesting story, or consequence of that story, is that the lead antagonists in that discussion throughout the 80s reached a point for 1990 at which those on the wrong side of the science argument realized that they were going to lose. They could hang on maybe for a couple more years, but they're going to lose. And frankly, a better strategy was to rush to the negotiating table and capture as much rent as possible. And that's what happened. And that's the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 that introduced sulfur trading and all kinds of issues. But there's a second story, which is not told generally, and I would say it's not told because it's generally not understood. And that is that also throughout the 80s, while this tit for tat was going on the science, everybody trying to protect their own interests, there was another story going on. Namely, my beloved Department of Energy was actually supporting the demonstration of cleanup technologies, scrubbers. This is a lot simpler problem than we're dealing with here in climate, but the scrubber technology. And I think the part of the story that's not often understood is that if that technology had not been at a point where the economics were understood to be reasonable. They ended up being only half of reasonable, in fact, but that the negotiators could negotiate because they also understood that the problem was solvable at a reasonable cost. The lesson for today, I think, is obvious. We are preparing the technology, the techno-economics, to be able to address climate change, much harder problem, pervades the economy, but we are preparing the way for that very surprising, rapid negotiation that is going to take place as the science tips more and more towards understanding that we need to address this, and the public understands more and more what the consequences are, especially extreme weather. And I think we will see a convergence along those lines at some point, which I will not predict. It's not going to be in the next 3 years, I will predict, but it may not be that much further along, because the public realization is advancing in the area of recognition. And by the way, the reason is pretty simple. I don't want to be overly cynical, but the public is really moving, especially from extreme weather, in my view, because the costs of not moving are no longer just focused on future generations. We do love them, but not that much. We really love the fact that we got to address our own pocketbooks. And that's happening more and more in so many ways. Direct charges, loss of life in some occasions, loss of insurance, all kinds of issues are converging to say that this is a here and now problem, and that's what will demand, I believe, political action. And going back to the story, I believe that action, when it occurs, will occur much more rapidly than most of us think.
So
that's my story.
By the way, I meant to say at the outset, we're going to talk for a half hour or so, and then we will open up for a few questions at the end. So if people want to start thinking about that, that's a heads up. So, but coming back, Ernie, so if that's a little bit of history, let's talk about today, and then we'll get to looking over the horizon. But in today's environment, for all we witness between drill baby drill and this most recent revocation of the endangerment finding, and we've got CBAM entering into its next phase in Europe. Obviously, it's concerning, to put it mildly, certainly for this audience. But as someone like yourself who has seen the arc of change over periods of time, how would you encourage the audience to put this current environment into a broader perspective?
First of all, Garf, let me just say that CBAM, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah.
If it is implemented properly. Yes. And that's the trouble, that right now there's a lot of fumbling going on and et cetera, but we can come back to that.
Yep.
But in terms of how to think about it, I think, look, first of all, energy transition is not a new thing, right? I mean, energy transitions have been going on for quite a while. But there are two, I think, really critical differences, and then some additional factors. Critical difference one is that there's now been an awakening, at least by many, that this transition, which means low carbon, needs to be accelerated pretty significantly relative to previous transitions which occurred in terms of major shifts of fuel. So pace is one thing, and pace is the one thing that, frankly, we can't be overly confident about at the moment. Secondly, I think the in previous so-called transitions, biomass to coal to oil to, go on, gas and maybe nuclear, renewables, et cetera. In previous transitions, they have always occurred at times of significant growth in energy use. And the actual transition never really challenged an incumbent. It was really an addition. Now we have to recognize that the transition must occur, and unfortunately it's not always recognized in this way, but it must occur in very different ways in countries and regions at different levels of economic development. So in particular, in the industrialized world, we can talk about load growth for electricity and data centers and all of that, but fundamentally, energy growth is not, off the charts the way it was, in the second half of the 19th century or something like that. And so the reality is that we are facing a much more jarring threat to incumbents.
Yep.
We need to displace technologies. Displacement of technologies is always associated with displacement of people's lives. That is not recognized adequately, and that's going to happen. On the other hand, if you take, let's say, developing Africa, energy use is going up rapidly. And so there we have a different challenge. The challenge is having the increase met by new technologies to the extent possible, which in turn won't work unless we reinvent our financial and investment system. That's your problem. So it's going to be very, very different sets of features that we need to manage this transition. But a third factor I'll mention, not in the sense of a difference to previous transitions, although one could frame it that way, and it came in that comment around disruptions. I think that many in our community have done a disservice to the community by stovepiping the discussions around climate. We've said for a long time that climate, security, social equity, which includes affordability, et cetera, financeability, bankability, all of these things have to be understood as one conversation. And when we stovepipe the conversation, we are talking about a transition that must happen as fast as we like. Almost nothing happens as fast as you like. We should be focused on as fast as you can. And if you don't address things like social equity issues, including affordability in these days, et cetera, you go backwards. I would give as an example another story, if you like.
Please.
Remember the story not that many years ago of the yellow jackets in Europe, the gilets jaunes. Frankly, Macron has still not recovered from his blunder of not incorporating social equity into his policy suggestions. And he won't recover, but somebody hopefully will recover there. So I think that's another issue that we really need to be pragmatic, and I think pragmatism is in fact coming into the conversation much more effectively than it has been, in recognizing that all of these factors must be included. This year, by the way, I did not cancel my participation in the Munich Security Conference. Lufthansa canceled my participation in the Munich Security Conference. But the reports are that, for example, as there have been in previous years, an underlying theme around energy going on. And this year, apparently, there was a bit of a phase transition to security. Energy and security was the discussion, as opposed to energy and warming or climate. But again, I'm saying it's all one conversation.
Yep.
And I think that's the way everyone in this room and beyond this room has to be thinking about it, because otherwise we're just not going to make progress as fast as we can, even in any of those areas, if we don't make progress in all the areas. And by the way, this goes back again and feeds into the that question of the predominant approach discussed for addressing climate is mitigation of current emissions of greenhouse gases. And let me be clear, I'm not arguing against this in any sense. But I don't think we internalize enough that that is the hardest damn thing to do. Because that's where, in the developed economies, we run straight into this issue of incumbents, et cetera. It is hard, and it's hard on people. In 2016, close to the end of the Obama administration, there was a South Lawn, White House South Lawn chat on climate that was a little bit bizarre. Leonardo DiCaprio was the moderator for Barack Obama and Katharine Hayhoe, who is a well-known climate scientist from Texas, and look it up. You can still find it on the internet. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, I think President Obama makes a very revealing, honest comment as he's being pushed by Leonardo DiCaprio in particular, but also to a certain extent Katharine, on the climate and the need to go as fast as we would like. Mm-hmm. And Obama says, roughly a quote, "Now wait a minute. You're telling me that there's this dad in Ohio who has to drive 50 miles each way to work every day. They're home trying to balance their family budget, and you want me to tell him how bad it's going to be in 50 years when he's worried about the price of gasoline tomorrow." Now, we got to do all those things. I'm not saying otherwise, but I am saying that if we do not include those factors in the discussion, we are just going to be behind the eight ball even more than meets the eye today. Sorry.
I'm trying to think how to relate to Leo as the moderator and me as the moderator, and I can't really quite crack it, other than our comparable looks.
I think he had more hair, actually.
Yeah, I think just a little bit.
Right.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the history. We talked about the current environment. Let's look over the horizon, and I want to do a sort of a 3A and a 3B. So let's talk about 2028, and then I want to talk about geoengineering. But for 2028, we were talking before we came over here about how's best to prepare for what will be yet another of the most consequential elections of our time. I've talked to people who would like to create the equivalent of the Project 2025 climate policy so that whoever the nominee is can step into that, the way President Trump in some ways stepped into it when he was running. I know you see that otherwise, but as you think about that moment in time, 3-ish years from now, or really 2.5 years from now, what's on your mind in terms of how best to prepare for everything that will be so important in that moment?
Well, let me focus on two areas. One, to go back to that story that we started with, the Clean Air Act amendments and all of that. As I said then, that it was really important to be techno-economically ready and by the way, being ready is always part of the story. You know, it's, if the moment comes to really move the ball forward and we're not ready, it's shame on us. So, you know, always have to be ready. But in that context, I hate to say it, but I don't believe we are at the same techno-economic stage for climate that we were at in that much easier problem in 1990 on sulfur. In particular, I would say, you know, roughly speaking, we are at a comparable stage with regard to electricity.
Yep.
And everybody likes to, you know, start to use the word energy and then talk about electricity, because it's where we've made the most progress and it's the easiest place to make progress. But nobody mentions the fact that electricity is not the majority of energy use, number one. And number two, I'll be slightly black and white. I mean, it's not quite entirely true, but we are in a very, very bad place across the board on molecules.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of exceptions, but nothing that materially changes the discussion. So one thing is, there's a lot of innovation to tackle, and generally, and I mean innovation in a broad sense, not just technology, but business models and policy, et cetera. But specifically on technology and the associated economics, we've got to pick up the pace dramatically, because we have not given the negotiators the comfort to know that they can cut the deal, let's be optimistic, and not have, let's say, an affordability explosion, because suddenly liquid fuels cost, you know, 3 times as much as they do today, et cetera, at scale.
Yep.
So you can argue the numbers, but I think that's one thing. Secondly, I think we need to find, and I'll include myself in that, we need to find better ways of communicating the importance of starting now, and you know, with the whole security and equity thing folded in, but starting now. And I'll give an example. You mentioned, maybe it was in the previous question, I think, you mentioned the endangerment finding.
Yep.
The EPA endangerment ruling. And I discussed this with one of my colleagues, Lynn Orr, who was here somewhere this morning. I'm sorry for a little excursion here, but
Please.
On the endangerment finding, there is no question the administration was setting up an argument to confront the science. They've completely turned tail on that. They recognized they weren't going to win that argument for both procedural and substantive issues. So instead, the endangerment finding that the EPA put out is all based on the process and recent Supreme Court rulings, the major doctrines issue, the Chevron issue, et cetera. So their argument is going to be, it's not the ruling, it's the courts. What they want to do is have the courts rule in this administration that EPA does not have the authority to address the question of greenhouse gases, as opposed to the science being wrong. We all may have our opinions as to how that will turn out in the courts. I could just say I do not have a particularly optimistic view as to how that will happen. But whatever the case, now going back to your question, my argument is we have to argue on the science. It's not the basis of the endangerment finding.
Yep.
It's that we're talking about people's lives, people's health, et cetera. You want to talk process? You want to talk litigation? You want to talk lawyers? Are there any lawyers in the room? No, I don't want to know. You see, you put your hand up. You shouldn't have. You fell for the bait. Anyway, but I think that's the argument. And to do that, we have to structure the argument in new ways. We need to find new ways of talking with Gen Z, for example. There is something called the Gen Z Lab. We're working with the Gen Z Lab to try to figure out a new narrative to target particular audiences. So I think that's very important. But another point I would just make before leaving this, Garf, is that in the current administration, and this is peripherally perhaps related to what you asked about, but the current administration, and maybe even some who would argue this fairly close to home here, where we're sitting, the argument is exactly 180 degrees wrong that lack of knowledge about certain elements of climate science is a reason for inaction. Exactly wrong. It's the reason for action. And if I may go on, because since you mentioned, I think you had two questions in there, you threw in the word geoengineering.
That was going to be my last question, so let's go there.
Okay, so let's go there. Climate science has got a whole bunch of, let me say, niggles where there's uncertainty. The big picture is quite clear in terms of the need for action. But there's a very, very big uncertainty in the climate science. And that is around what is typically called, I don't like the name particularly, but what are typically called tipping points. They're not even included in the models because they're too complicated. We have no idea if with our current trajectory, we haven't already passed certain points of essentially no return. I showed this to Garf earlier. Yesterday, as I was traveling out here, I was looking at the Financial Times. If you didn't look at it, look at the big read in yesterday's FT. It's about the discoloration of rivers in the Arctic because of iron being released by the permafrost melting. Well, if the permafrost keeps on melting and all the methane goes out, as you know, it's exactly the wrong feedback loop. And we're not going to recover. There's a number of other things, West Antarctic ice sheet, conveyor belt in the Atlantic, all kinds of these things. And so, to your question, we have come to a somewhat reluctant conclusion that if we're going to address climate change, we need to keep working at the mitigation of current emissions. What I said earlier is hard for a variety of reasons. We need to work at something that, frankly, I think our group has done a lot to help surface over the last decade: carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. The reluctant part is I think we've got to go to the third stage, and we've got to start a serious program of geoengineering, things like solar radiation management, not in the hope of using it, in the hope of not using it, but in the realization that if we want to be responsible in any possible need to use geoengineering, to buy some time, frankly, because of major, essentially irreversible climate change, I think that's a 20-year program.
Yeah.
And it's like the famous Lyoté story about planting a tree. Well, the best time to plant it would have been 20 years ago, but the best time to plant it is now. I think we've got to start now on a coordinated international program that looks at experiments very, very incrementally with strong focus on verifying what might be risks in doing that. So it's not a program for the faint of heart. I know it's not a program that everybody jumps up and down about. Actually, I don't either, but I think we need to start it. And I think that this is a discussion that has to happen now in polite company. It hasn't.
So just on that note, Ernie, as those who've been in my class will know, I preach about the call to action and the need for talent to come into this ecosystem, and certainly your comments underscore the importance of that, and no better group than this audience than to hammer that point home. So I'm very glad you're doing that. We have a few minutes, so we can probably take one or two questions from the audience.
Could I just say,
please,
just to repeat something earlier, in terms of the students and their trajectories from the business school in particular, that I want to go back to that statement that innovation is not just technology.
Yep.
It's also business model and finance and policy and regulation. We need innovation across the board, and it's going to take a lot of different talents to address that. And so I hope that a lot of the people in this room are going to be a big part of that going forward.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll take a question here and then up front, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, there's a mic coming right here.
Hi, thank you very much. Hi, thank you very much for your thoughts and for coming here today and sharing with us. In any case, I wondered if you could make some. My name is Gordon Bloom. I teach here at Stanford. Courses about social entrepreneurship and sustainability. I'm wondering, many of my students are concerned about the global situation, and I'm wondering about your comments about the role of energy in what's going on globally in the political situation, for instance, in the Middle East or in the Ukraine, and how that's changed over time, and what you might see as being the role of all of us in trying to understand how to kind of contribute to the path to a more peaceful and prosperous world, and a world that's going to be freer of conflict from the effects of our competition over energy.
If you could solve that, Ernie, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, well, so first I'll make an irrelevant comment, since that'll be much easier. But it's of some relevance to what you're saying, and I'll come back to that more directly. But if you think about energy and sustainability, reliability, affordability, sustainability, let's say for the CEO of a utility, is the least important of those three in terms of job security. The lights go out, you get fired. The prices go up too much, you'll get a lot of pressure from your regulators. Sustainability, well, that's nice.
It's tomorrow's problem.
So we got to, and which is also one reason why all of them have to be discussed together. Now, in terms of security, because of Ukraine, you mentioned Ukraine, the Middle East has been threatening in a certain sense, but not really impacting energy security at this stage. Energy security has obviously come into play most strongly after the Ukraine invasion and the beginning again of reuse of energy as a weapon. I would just note that at the Munich Security Conference, apparently, that sentiment was expressed equally about Russia and the United States. And that Europeans, many Europeans, at least in the sidelines of the conference, apparently were talking about, well, we don't want to trade dependence on Russia for gas to dependence on the United States for gas. And so there's I think, a lot of rebuilding of trust among friends and allies that is a big part of the answer to your question. It's beyond energy. But the other thing to remember, and this is again attached to Ukraine. Okay, another story. In 2014, people forget, Ukraine was invaded in 2014, not just 2022. And in 2014, that's when Crimea was annexed, basically, et cetera, parts of the Donbass. That led the G7 to G7 plus the EU, and frankly, it was led by President Obama and me, as Secretary of Energy at the time, to convene with the G7 and the EU to write a modern version of what energy security means. It had not been done since the early 70s. A completely different market structure, obviously with oil, et cetera. The outcome of that, and this is again goes to where one can do things, is that reconstitution of energy security, the definition of energy security, was, I think, really the first time that it was put into clear, neon lights, that things like renewables were part of energy security. Energy insecurity was all about carbon. And so I think the whole discussion around energy transition, linkage to security, should not be forgotten. Yeah. But the other thing, again, is the broader equity issue. And I think it would be very helpful to have more people speaking about, like, we understand that things like energy transition at different levels of economic development are going to be different, and they should be different. And it's how we manage that so that we collectively go to the right secular trend in the long term. It's not going to be pretty, because we're not going to meet any of the goals that have been put forward, frankly, globally. But I would just maybe end this response at least by saying, you know what? I'm sick and tired of being told what it's going to take to meet unattainable goals. I'd like to hear what it's going to take to reach practical goals. I think that's an important discussion.
We are at time, but I love that as a closing comment. So please, if I could ask the audience to join me in thanking the Secretary.
Thank you, Garth.